Till this day, this experience still gives me nightmares. I've never spoken about it publicly because every time I replay that afternoon in my head, I can still hear the sound that changed my life forever. Maybe talking about it will finally help me carry some of the weight. My name is Alan. I am 30 years old, and for 5 years I worked at an iron manufacturing factory in Cincinnati. By the time this happened, I knew every machine, every safety procedure, and every sound the factory could make. I'd seen minor injuries over the years, but nothing that ever made me question whether I wanted to return to work the next day. Our company took safety seriously. We attended regular training sessions, wore full protective equipment, and followed strict protocols around the furnaces and molten iron. We believed that if everyone respected the rules, everyone would go home safely. I believed that more than anyone, and that belief was destroyed on a Friday afternoon. The day started like any other summer shift. The heat outside was already unbearable before I even stepped through the factory gates, and once I entered the production floor, it felt as though I had walked into another world entirely. The enormous furnaces radiated constant waves of heat that never gave your body a chance to cool down. Even after years on the job, sweat still rolled down my face within minutes of clocking in. You never really got used to it. You simply learned how to work despite it. That morning, our supervisor reminded us that 5 industrial training students would be joining our section for the day. They were all between 20 and 23 years old, eager to learn, and probably excited to experience a real manufacturing environment instead of reading about it in a classroom. I gathered them together near the observation platform before the shift became too busy. I introduced myself and explained that they were entering one of the most dangerous parts of the factory. I pointed toward the massive furnace below us where molten iron glowed with an intense orange light. I told them that everything they were looking at could kill someone in seconds if they stopped paying attention. They laughed nervously, and I smiled just enough to ease the tension before becoming serious again. I reminded them that confidence without discipline was dangerous. I explained where they could stand, what they could touch, what they should never touch, and why every painted safety line on the floor existed for a reason. One of the students asked if accidents still happened in modern factories with so many safety systems in place. I answered honestly and told him they were rare because everyone respected the rules. Looking back now, I wish I had never said those words. Among the students, one stood out almost immediately. His name was Grisham. He was 22 years old and studying information technology, but he had a genuine curiosity about industrial automation. While the others looked around in amazement, he kept asking practical questions about the machines, the control systems, and the production process. He listened carefully, repeated instructions back to me, and never acted like he already knew everything. I remember thinking he would probably have a bright future because he was willing to learn before trying to impress anyone. After I completed my scheduled furnace inspection and finished monitoring the latest pour into the holding vessel, it was time to rotate the students through different workstations. Each group was assigned a supervisor, so they could observe safely without getting in anyone's way. Grisham was assigned to work directly with me. I felt comfortable with that because he seemed responsible, and I believed I could teach him more than just the basics. We climbed onto the elevated operating platform overlooking the molten iron below. From there, we controlled much of the equipment remotely. The intense glow from beneath reflected off every steel surface around us. I explained how the conveyor delivered raw materials, how impurities were removed during processing, and how the operators monitored temperatures before each pour. Grisham watched every movement with complete attention. Every few minutes he nodded and repeated the sequence back to me to make sure he understood it correctly. The shift continued smoothly for almost an hour. The machinery hummed with its usual rhythm. Overhead cranes moved heavy loads across the building, and radios crackled with routine communication between operators. Everything felt completely normal. At one point, Grisham smiled and admitted that he never imagined this much coordination was required just to produce iron. I laughed and told him that most people only saw the finished product and never appreciated how much planning happened behind the scenes. He thanked me for taking the time to explain everything, instead of simply telling him to stand in one place and watch. I told him every experienced worker had once been new, and somebody had been patient enough to teach us too. As we continued the training, I demonstrated how the control panel communicated with the machinery below. The actual work happened several meters beneath us, where the molten iron remained contained inside heavily reinforced vessels. Our platform existed so operators could oversee the process without standing anywhere near the extreme heat. I reminded Grisham several times to keep both hands free whenever he walked across the graded floor, because even though the platform had guardrails, distraction was always the first step toward an accident. He nodded each time and thanked me for repeating the safety advice instead of assuming he already remembered it. A maintenance crew was finishing work near one side of the platform, so we adjusted our path to give them room. At the same time, another operator called my name from behind, asking me to confirm a temperature reading on one of the display screens. I turned away for what could not have been more than 3 or 4 seconds. I checked the display, answered his question, and immediately looked back toward Grisham, but he was no longer standing where I had left him. At first I thought he had simply stepped behind one of the support columns, but then I heard the unmistakable scrape of a boot losing traction against metal. I spun around just in time to see him stumbling near an access section of the platform. His arms reached out instinctively as he tried to regain his balance. I shouted his name with everything I had, and he looked directly at me. The expression on his face was not panic at first. It was confusion. He genuinely believed he still had enough time to recover. I lunged toward him without thinking. Everything that happened next felt both impossibly fast and painfully slow. I stretched my arm forward, but there was too much distance between us. Another worker rushed from the opposite direction, reaching just as desperately as I did, yet neither of us could close the gap in time. Grisham's footing disappeared beneath him, and gravity took over before anyone could stop it. The entire factory seemed to freeze. Someone slammed the emergency stop. Alarm horns erupted across the building. Radios exploded with frantic voices calling for medical teams and supervisors. Workers abandoned their stations and ran toward the platform, hoping there was still something they could do. I wanted to believe the same thing, but deep inside I already knew the truth. I cannot accurately describe what it feels like to realize that another person's life has slipped beyond anyone's ability to save. The memory that stayed with me was not what I saw. It was the helplessness. It was the sound of dozens of experienced workers desperately trying to solve a problem that had no solution. I remember screaming his name over and over, as though hearing a familiar voice could somehow change reality. I remember people pulling me backward, because I kept trying to get closer even though there was nothing left for me to do. Every instinct in my body demanded that I help him. Yet every part of my training told me that entering that area would only create another victim. Within minutes, the entire production line was shut down. Emergency responders arrived almost immediately, but they could only secure the scene and begin the procedures that follow a catastrophic industrial accident. The supervisors moved all the students away from the area. Some of them were crying. Others stood completely silent, unable to process what they had just witnessed. I sat against a steel support column with my helmet still on my head, staring at the platform where Grisham had been standing only moments earlier. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, convincing myself that if I had answered that temperature question 1 second later, or 1 second earlier, maybe I would have been close enough to grab him. That single thought still follows me everywhere. The factory remained closed while investigators examined every detail of the accident. They reviewed security footage, interviewed every witness, inspected the equipment, and confirmed that there had been no mechanical failure. They concluded it was a tragic workplace accident. Their report answered every technical question, but it answered none of the questions that haunted me afterward. Everyone told me it was not my fault, including Grisham's parents when I met them several weeks later, but forgiveness from other people does not always erase the guilt you place on yourself. I eventually returned to work because life does not stop after tragedy, but I was never the same person. Every time I trained a new employee, I found myself repeating safety instructions far more than necessary. I watched every step they took. If someone stood too close to a railing, I immediately corrected them. Some thought I was overly strict, but none of them knew why. I never wanted another family to receive the phone call that changed Grisham's family's life forever. Even after leaving that factory, the memories refused to leave me. I got this story from the internet, but I will call the writer Mark. I'm not going to beat around the bush, because the trauma from that day still follows me everywhere I go. I worked at a local iron factory in Scunthorpe, Lincolnshire, England, a town that has been built around steel for generations. The factory was enormous, filled with towering furnaces, overhead cranes, hydraulic presses, and twisting machines that never seemed to stop moving. The air constantly smelled of burning metal, oil, and smoke, and by the end of every shift my ears rang so loudly that silence almost sounded unnatural. I had been working there for nearly 3 years, and although everyone knew the place was dangerous, you eventually became numb to the constant warnings because the machines became part of your daily routine. Every experienced worker had scars somewhere on their body. Some had missing fingertips. Others walked with permanent limps. We joked that the factory always took something from everyone eventually. At the time, I thought they were exaggerating. It was a Tuesday morning just after 11. The shift had been moving smoothly, and my closest friend Matthew was working beside me at the automated iron twisting station. The machine was designed to twist long lengths of heated reinforcing steel into precise shapes before they cooled. Although most of the process was automatic, we still had to manually guide the glowing bars into the alignment rollers whenever they entered the twisting assembly. The steel came out of the furnace bright orange, almost white at the hottest points, and even standing a few feet away felt like opening the door of an oven large enough to swallow a truck. Every few minutes we would grab our long steel positioning hooks, nudge the bars into place, step back, and allow the rollers to grip them before the twisting arms took over. It was repetitive work, but if your timing was off by even a second, the machine could catch your tool or your glove before you had time to react. Matthew had been in unusually good spirits that morning. During one of our short pauses, he laughed and told me he had finally saved enough money to put a deposit on a small flat with his girlfriend. He pulled out his phone for a second and showed me a picture of the place before quickly putting it away, because supervisors hated seeing phones on the production floor. I remember smiling and telling him that maybe now he would finally stop complaining about his landlord. He laughed and replied that if everything went well, he would hand in his notice before the end of the year because factory work was slowly destroying his body. I jokingly told him the factory would never let him leave that easily. Looking back now, I wish I had never said those words. Another heated bar rolled toward our station, glowing so brightly that it shimmered in the air. We both moved into position like we had done thousands of times before. I guided mine perfectly into the alignment rollers, stepped back, and watched the twisting assembly grab it exactly as expected. Matthew leaned in to position his own section. For a brief second, the steel flexed harder than usual as pressure built inside the rollers. Instead of settling into the guide channel, the bar suddenly slipped sideways with incredible force. I saw his shoulders tense as he instinctively reached farther with the positioning hook to regain control. The curved end of his hook caught inside one of the rotating guide collars instead of slipping free like it normally would. Before he could let go, the spinning collar ripped the hook straight out of alignment. His thick, protective glove wrapped around the handle as it twisted violently, and the force yanked his right hand directly toward the rotating feed rollers. Everything happened so quickly that my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Matthew screamed with a sound I had never heard another human being make as his fingers disappeared between the hardened steel rollers. The machine did not slow down. It continued pulling with relentless mechanical force. I watched his glove tear apart almost instantly before his fingers folded backward in ways they were never supposed to bend. Bones cracked one after another, with sharp popping sounds that somehow cut through the deafening roar of the machinery. Blood exploded across the polished metal housing in thick sprays as the rollers crushed everything they grabbed. He desperately tried to pull back, but the machine had far more strength than any person could fight against. His wrist reached the rollers next, and I could hear the grinding of bone beneath the screaming motors. His eyes locked onto mine with pure panic, silently begging me to do something because he knew he was losing. My body moved before my mind caught up. I lunged toward the emergency stop, slammed my palm against the red button with every bit of strength I had, and at the same time threw my shoulder into Matthew's body as hard as I could. The rollers took another horrifying fraction of his arm before the hydraulic brakes finally engaged. The entire machine shuddered violently as it slowed, but by then the damage had already been done. The force of my shove tore what remained of his crushed wrist free from the rollers, sending both of us crashing onto the concrete floor. Blood pumped from the mangled stump in thick rhythmic bursts, splattering across my face, my overalls, and the gray factory floor. It was so much blood that for a second my brain refused to believe it could all be coming from one person. Matthew rolled onto his back, screaming uncontrollably while clutching what little remained of his arm against his chest. His fingers were gone, his wrist had been completely destroyed, and fragments of bone and shredded glove were still lodged between the machine's rollers. The smell of hot iron mixed with fresh blood created an odor so sickening that one of the nearby workers immediately turned away and vomited into a drainage channel. Within seconds, alarms echoed throughout the production hall. Workers abandoned their stations and rushed toward us while supervisors shouted for everyone to stay back. One of the maintenance engineers wrapped a heavy pressure bandage around Matthew's arm, while another worker tightened a tourniquet above his elbow. The factory medics arrived almost immediately with a stretcher, oxygen equipment, and trauma kits. They worked with remarkable speed, speaking calmly to Matthew even as his face turned pale from blood loss. I stood frozen only a few feet away with blood dripping from my sleeves, unable to hear anything except the ringing inside my own head. One of the medics looked at me and firmly told me to sit down because I was in shock, but I could not move. I kept staring at the twisting machine where pieces of Matthew's torn glove and flesh were still trapped between the steel rollers, as though nothing unusual had happened. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, and they rushed him away under flashing blue lights. We learned later that the surgeons managed to save his life, but they could not save his hand. His right wrist had been crushed beyond repair, ending his career at the factory forever. Management called it a tragic workplace accident. Investigators took photographs, statements were collected, and by the following week another worker had already been assigned to Matthew's station as though he had never existed. Everyone eventually returned to work, but I could never look at that twisting machine the same way again. My name is Joshua, and I am 40 years old. I own one of the largest structural steel fabrication factories in my state. We manufacture heavy steel beams, columns, roofing trusses, warehouse frames, industrial tanks, and custom iron components for construction companies across the country. The business took me almost 15 years to build, and at its peak it was worth several $1 million. Running a factory of that size teaches you very quickly that steel has no emotions. It does not care whether you are rich or poor, experienced or new. One careless mistake can destroy equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and one moment of negligence can leave families mourning someone who left home expecting to return before dinner. Over the years I dealt with machinery failures, fires started by faulty welding cables, forklifts overturning, workers suffering broken bones, and enough lawsuits to make me question whether expanding the business had been worth the sacrifice. Every accident came with investigations, compensation, insurance battles, and sleepless nights. Yet none of them prepared me for what happened on one quiet Sunday afternoon, because that single incident almost destroyed everything I had spent my life building. Sundays were always different inside our factory. Production slowed down because most employees preferred spending time with their families or attending church. Only a handful of workers volunteered for overtime since the company paid almost double for weekend shifts. Their responsibilities were usually limited to maintenance, cleaning, inventory checks, and preparing materials for Monday morning production. The atmosphere felt strangely peaceful compared to the deafening noise of weekdays. Instead of hearing dozens of welding arcs flashing at once and cranes moving continuously across the ceiling, there were only scattered sounds echoing through the enormous building. You could actually hear your own footsteps between the steel racks. I often visited on Sundays because they allowed me to inspect the facility without constantly being interrupted by production issues. That particular afternoon, I had no reason to believe the day would become one of the worst days of my career until my phone rang, and the panic in my production manager's voice instantly made my stomach tighten because he shouted my name and told me I needed to get to the factory immediately since something impossible had just happened. The 20-minute drive to the factory felt much longer because my production manager refused to explain anything over the phone. Every time I asked what had happened, he simply repeated that I needed to see it with my own eyes. His voice sounded different from the calm man I had known for almost 8 years. He was breathing heavily, and in the background I could hear workers shouting to each other, although there should not have been enough people in the building to create that much commotion. By the time I pulled into the compound, I noticed 3 security guards standing outside instead of their usual positions. None of them looked at me with their usual smiles. They simply watched me park before one of them hurried over and said, "Sir, nobody has touched anything. We've kept everyone away from that section just as Mr. Collins instructed." I thanked him and walked toward the main fabrication hall, but every step made me more uneasy because the entire building felt unnaturally quiet. Even the few machines that normally ran during overtime had been shut down. As I entered the production floor, I saw almost every worker gathered near the center aisle, all staring toward the same direction without speaking. My production manager walked over the moment he noticed me and pointed ahead without saying a word. I followed his finger, and for several seconds my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. One of the massive structural steel beams that had been stored on the elevated overhead storage rack was no longer there. The beam had broken free from its restraints and crashed straight through the work area below. It had punched through thick steel fabrication tables, as though they were made of cardboard, shattered industrial tool cabinets into twisted scrap, and buried itself several feet into the reinforced concrete floor. The impact had been so violent that chunks of concrete were scattered across the hall, and several support rails had bent from the force. That single beam weighed several tons. Looking at the destruction it left behind made my legs feel weak because I knew exactly what stood in that location every weekday morning. That section of the workshop was where more than 20 welders and fabricators spent most of their shifts measuring, cutting, grinding, and assembling steel frames. On a normal Monday, the entire area would have been packed with workers standing shoulder to shoulder around the fabrication tables. The beam had fallen directly into the middle of their workspace. There was no chance anyone standing beneath it could have survived. It would not have knocked them aside or trapped them under debris. It would have driven straight through their bodies before they even realized something was wrong. I slowly turned to my production manager and asked what time it had fallen. He looked down at his watch as though trying to relive the moment and quietly answered, 2:12 this afternoon. I stared back at the beam and imagined the exact same time on a regular working day. Lunch would have been over. Every station would have been occupied. Sparks would have been flying. Conversations would have been filling the air. Instead of silence, there would have been screams. Instead of damaged equipment, there would have been bodies scattered across the workshop. That realization settled over everyone in the building at the same moment, and none of us could shake the terrifying thought that if this had happened just 24 hours later, my factory would have become the scene of a mass casualty disaster. The next morning, I arrived at the factory before sunrise. The fallen beam was still lying exactly where it had landed, because I had ordered everyone not to move a single piece of evidence until the investigation was complete. Within a few hours, the safety inspectors, structural engineers, insurance representatives, and our legal team began arriving one after another. The entire production floor felt tense as cameras photographed every angle of the damaged storage rack, while engineers climbed onto elevated platforms to inspect the remaining steel. I stayed close enough to hear their conversations, and every sentence seemed to make the situation worse. They ruled out sabotage almost immediately because there was no evidence that anyone had tampered with the restraints. One of the engineers eventually pointed to the twisted support assembly and explained that a retaining bracket had developed microscopic fatigue cracks over many years of carrying enormous loads. The damage had been hidden inside the metal, where routine visual inspections could not easily detect it. Once the bracket finally gave way, the entire load shifted, overwhelming the remaining supports until the beam broke free and plunged straight to the ground. Hearing that explanation did not bring me any comfort because all I could think about was how close we had come to burying more than 20% of my employees. The insurance company immediately began asking difficult questions. They wanted maintenance records, inspection reports, equipment certifications, and every document related to the overhead storage system. Our lawyers warned me that if investigators concluded we had ignored any warning signs, the lawsuits alone could bankrupt the company, even if nobody had actually died. Production was suspended while the damaged section of the building was declared unsafe, and clients began calling to ask why their deliveries had suddenly stopped. Every hour the factory remained closed cost us thousands of dollars, and I could feel 15 years of hard work hanging by a thread. Despite the financial pressure, I knew there was only one decision I could live with. I gathered every department manager inside the conference room and told them that I did not care how much money it cost or how much storage capacity we lost. I would never again allow heavy steel to be stored above the heads of my workers. Over the following weeks, we completely redesigned the factory. Every elevated rack that held massive iron beams was dismantled and replaced with reinforced ground-level storage, where forklifts could safely move materials without anyone working beneath suspended loads. We rewrote our safety procedures, retrained every employee, introduced more frequent structural inspections, and changed the entire workflow even though it slowed production and reduced profits. We repaired the damage, accepted the financial loss, and moved forward with a safer factory, where no heavy iron would ever again be stored high above the people whose lives depended on going home safely at the end of every shift.